It's nice to see some new faces showing up on the list, including our new AD. Welcome, Deb.
Hey, yes, it's nice to be here.
Martin, do you have slides? I should say good morning.
I do not. I did not know that I was on the agenda. There you go.
Oh,
I don't know where the agenda is.
We'll post the link in the chat for you.
All right, thank you.
Apologies for the delay. I'm having some trouble with the Meet Echo slide upload tools. It's not giving us the ones that are in the data tracker. It's giving us something otherwise random. Yeah, I'm getting the slides up. Yes, Deb?
Yeah, no, I clicked the upload and manage slide button, and it looks like they're loading now.
Okay. So, agenda bashing. Martin, since you didn't know you were on this agenda, and I'm sorry that we didn't close the loop with your request, which I had seen, do you want to be on here or drop from it? What's your wish?
So I would like to talk briefly about the last item. I don't think I asked for time on the binomial DP one, so we can probably drop that.
Okay.
The story there is that we discovered it's not quite as good as we thought it was, and have to go back and do a little bit more work.
Great. Any other agenda requests? I think I saw that Brandon was going to be doing some of the presentations here.
Yeah, that's right.
That's correct.
Great. Do we have a minute taker other than us chairs?
Hi, Sam. I'm happy to act as minute taker today, if
Right.
there's no one else available.
Great. Chris, Brandon, would you all like to start?
I believe we should show the IETF note well. If you close your slides, I can put it up. Okay. So just a reminder, this is an IETF working group session. It is covered by the IETF note well. That includes a variety of obligations that you incur by participating in this session, including some legal obligations related to IPR and also other obligations about behaving well and being respectful of other contributors here. If you're not familiar with these policies, I would strongly recommend that you drop from the meeting, take some time to familiarize yourself, and only join the meeting when you're sure that you can abide with these policies. Thanks. Okay, I think we're ready for our first presentation.
All right, I am working on the slides. Someone's got to, there we go. Okay, cool. All right. All right, cool. All right, well, welcome everybody. So I will be reviewing what's changed since we last spoke at IETF 120. Brandon and I are gonna lead a discussion through the remaining open issues. Hopefully we can resolve a bunch of them today. Let's start with, I wanted to throw VDAF in here because this is actually we feel pretty much done. So for reminder, VDAF is a CFRG document that specifies how DAP, what class of protocols DAP works with, and also the PRIO3 and its variants that we use. So we have made a lot of improvements to both PRIO3 and Poplar in the latest draft. I won't try to enumerate them here, but we add functionality, we improve security, we improve security considerations and things like that. And one thing I wanted to flag is there's an API change in draft 12 that adds this thing called a application context string. This is meant to allow some defense in depth measures for when you're designing your VDAFs, and we use this in both Prio 3 and Poplar to improve security against cross-protocol attacks. So what we're doing in draft 13, it's largely editorial. David Cook and I have been working really hard on getting this ready for research group last call. We've also we've changed the aggregation API in response to some feedback from Ben Schwartz between now and 120. It's a lot more consistent with the way we actually do aggregation. So that's really nice. Yeah, we feel, you know, we're probably going to get the ball rolling here very soon on like figuring out if we need crypto review panel feedback, and if not, we'll try to do last call for this document probably at the next IETF. From what we want to know from the people in this room is, do you think this is done? So are there features you've been wanting for the VDAF draft that we haven't implemented yet? If so, now's the time to bring those up. Of course, there's still times to change things, so just let us know. Okay, moving on to DAP. So the headline change here is that we have merged the PR that we talked about at 120, which allows the helper to handle aggregation, each step of the aggregation job asynchronously. Folks will remember this was somewhat controversial. We spent a long time looking at different options for alternatives to this. Can we make the computation cheaper? Can we specify it in a way that, can we do better in terms of like mapping to more to different, more conventional architectures for distributed systems? What we ended up with basically is this was the least invasive change that solved the problem, and so that's what we merged. Appreciate very much everyone's feedback on that. I think we're in a much better place now. Beyond that, we adopted VDAF 12, so that's a significant breaking change. Other than that, basically cleanup stuff like removing some old features that we're not using anymore, getting through some breaking changes we've been holding off on, and that's about it. So what is DAP 13 so far? Well, we have some editorial improvements. We have been looking at making IANA considerations better. There are still some open questions here, but I don't believe we're going to try to talk about that in this meeting today. Okay, and then in other news, we have adopted a new document. This is a report extension called TaskProv. It's also called TaskBind. This is basically how do you derive the task ID? Well, what we want to do is DAP itself doesn't specify how to do this. You can pick it at random. You could do something else. What we do here is we want everyone in the protocol to agree on what the task configuration is. And so we just specify an encoding of the task configuration, and we hash that to get the task ID. So it's a nice property. It fits neatly into the current extension framework. So what we adopted is basically like, you know, what was there for the adoption call, plus some minor changes that were sitting on the main branch. In TaskProv 01, we have been working on, so we're working towards compatibility with draft 12, and there's some breaking changes and some minor bug fixes. And also we spent a little bit of time looking at IANA considerations. Again, there's an open question here, but we'll chat about that later. Okay. Now into open issues, but first I want to pause here and catch up on the chat. Does anybody anyone want to jump in the queue and ask questions or make a comment? Martin, do you want to air your consideration, your editorial concerns for the draft real quick, the VDAF draft?
Yeah, I haven't really had enough time to go through and work these up. But when I was looking at doing the thing we'll be talking about later, I had a very difficult time trying to get through the description of particularly the Prio parts. I think once you get into the meat of the different VDAFs, it's I found the structure and some of the explanation very hard to follow. So, and the use of code in that document is a little too much for me. So,
all right.
I'll give you some feedback, more concrete feedback than that, though, at some point.
Yeah, that's. I think that's the way forward there. Thank you. Okay, so 3 buckets of things. Aggregation skew recovery, which Brandon is going to jump on and describe that in a second. And then extensibility. This includes some issues filed by Martin as he's been poking around. And then just a grab bag of stuff that I wanted to hopefully should not be controversial, and but nonetheless we want everyone's help making a decision on. So Brandon, I will run the slides for you. Why don't you take it away?
Thanks. Could we move forward to the first slide? Next slide. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about some potential changes to the aggregation skew recovery strategy used by DApp to establish what the problem is. So DApp is a network protocol. It is essential. The aggregation interaction of the DApp protocol is essentially a serial sequence of HTTP requests and responses initiated by the leader. The goal of which is to perform the VDAF preparation process, recovering output shares from the input shares uploaded by the clients. Like any network protocol, hardware crashes or network transit failures might cause the responses to be lost in transit. In particular, the helper might believe that a particular step of the aggregation process was successful, while the leader does not successfully process the response. Another way to phrase this problem is the state updates between the leader and the helper are not transactional, and it is unlikely to be feasible to make them transactional. So we need some kind of solution to address state skew between the leader and the helper. The currently specified solution for quite some time is that the leader can retry the previous step. So when the helper receives an aggregation request for a particular aggregation job, if the request is for the step before what its state says should be the next step, it remembers the last response that it sent, checks that the request matches the previous request, and if so, sends the previous response. This is equivalent to idempotent request handling. Next slide, please. So this was found to be somewhat contentious. Specifically, we started investigating what happens if the leader wants to restart the aggregation process from the beginning rather than from the previous step. And to be clear, the goal of this was not so much to allow the leader to recover from arbitrarily losing the aggregation state. That is somewhat outside the scope of DApp, but it was more to permit leader implementations which did not need to write to durable storage between each step of the aggregation process. The first attempt to address this issue was to allow the helper to retain enough information to rewind to any previous step of the aggregation job. So effectively, the leader could resend a request from any prior point in the aggregation job. The helper would be expected to validate that the request was equivalent to the prior request and resend the response. This solution was somewhat contentious simply because it increases the amount of state that the helper needs to track by quite a bit. The next attempt at this was specifying that the helper retain enough information to rewind the aggregation process to the beginning. So when the leader realizes that it is skewed with the helper, rather than resending the previous step's request, it restarts the aggregation from the beginning. The primary downside of this approach is that in a VDAF with many steps, we may be wasting quite a bit of work with each retry attempt. However, in practice, all of the VDAFs that we are currently using are single-step VDAFs, and it is very likely that VDAFs will contain a small number of steps, so perhaps this trade-off is acceptable. Next slide, please. There we go. But recently we discovered that there may be another problem with these alternative skew recoveries problems, so-called rewind and fork attacks on VDAP preparation. So to remind everyone, the purpose of DAP is ultimately to perform this VDAP preparation and allow aggregates to be recovered. The VDAP preparation is a serial sequence of calls between two aggregators, each of which starts with a distinct input share and several other shared pieces of information. And then via a sequence of API calls and communications, an output share is recovered. DAP's aggregation protocol is effectively performing this VDAP preparation in a batched fashion. Next slide, please. So our threat model is that the attacker partially controls the computation and inputs at each step. So next slide, please. So if an attacker can rewind to a previous step or to the beginning and rerun the VDAP preparation, but change some of the messages, it may be able to gain an advantage, possibly attacking the privacy property of the VDAF. Or to put it another way, VDAFs expect that they will only be run once. An attacker that can rerun a VDAF multiple times may be able to attack the privacy of the VDAF. Unfortunately, both of the alternative methods of skew recovery have a problem here. Because we realize that not only do we need the helper to track the request that the leader has sent, but we would also require the leader to track the responses that the helper has sent. Otherwise, on a retry scenario, a helper can possibly sub out messages from the last time it went through preparation and achieve more information about the underlying measurement than should be possible. So, since the original motivation for changing the retry mechanism was to permit a leader not to need to checkpoint into durable storage each step of the aggregation process, this would seem to be a serious problem. So we need to decide what to do, but right now I think we need to either somehow fix the other retry mechanisms or accept that durable storage rights are required for the leader between each step of the aggregation process. Thanks. I think, Tim, you have your hand up.
I do, thank you. Okay, so I want to ask a question about the rewind then fork attacks. So if I understand right, what this is that the leader could like run preparation of some set of reports with a given aggregation parameter, and then do it again with a different aggregation parameter, right? But my recollection of how anti-replay goes is that you commit to the aggregation parameter the leader commits to an aggregation parameter the first time it sends an aggregation job to the helper. So if the leader did do this attack and vary the aggregation parameter the second time around, shouldn't that get rejected by the helper? Or am I missing something?
So this attack isn't specific to the aggregation parameter. It's more changing the messages in the underlying VDAF in order to cause the other aggregator to respond differently. So it's less an attack against switching the aggregation parameter and more an attack against something like perhaps the VDAF has some piece of data that must probabilistically be correct, and the aggregator gaining multiple attempts to pass the probabilistic check.
Yeah, okay, because I thought like for Prio concretely, the aggregation job messages are deterministic is I think kind of the word I want here, right? In the sense that, yeah, like they won't vary. But so what we're concerned about here is a hypothetical VDAF that might be defined in the future, where for the same verification key, the same input shares and the same aggregation parameter, there's some other kind of variability in the message that the leader constructs that would effectively allow it to like fuzz the helper's handler of these messages. Is that the idea?
So it is actually more, it is more concretely an issue, a potential issue for Prio. So you can't send the same, like you shouldn't be able to like send two different prep shares and observe two different responses. We don't believe that that's safe in general. We don't have like a concrete, like this leads to a privacy violation, but it's like outside of the threat model that exists for this class of protocols. So you shouldn't do it.
Okay. I think I get it. Thanks.
And I would note that for the special case of one-step VDAFs, including Prio 3 and I think all other VDAFs that are commonly considered, all of these skew recovery mechanisms are safe. It is only for multi-step VDAFs where this starts to become an issue. And that's just due to the way they were specified. We always check a sufficient amount to ensure that one-step VDAFs are sufficiently protected. Watson.
Thanks.
Hello. So I'll freely admit to not really following the questioning. I mean, it sounds like this is an issue where you might go back up into the middle of processing a bunch of reports, go through the protocol to verify them, add in the shares again. I'm wondering if we can't simplify the requirement. You know, it's okay to drop a couple reports on the floor. Maybe the answer is to say, well, you have a batch of 100 reports. Either you finish the job, add it to your aggregates, or you don't, and we drop it on the floor because you might have gone halfway.
I think that's a worthwhile consideration. In fact, I believe that's supported by DAP today. The skew recovery mechanism is specified as a may, I believe, rather than a must. So implementations are not required to implement it if they do not wish to, if they're willing to accept the data loss of dropping failed aggregations on the floor. But yes, I do think that that's a worthwhile consideration for realistic deployments.
Yeah, I mean, you can batch. You can say, okay, we only have 50 or 100 of these that we drop on the floor at a time.
So it may be a little more complicated than that. It depends on which step of the aggregation ultimately led to the skew. So an individual aggregation job is likely to only contain maybe a few hundred reports. But if one of the aggregators considers the aggregation job to be completed and therefore has committed the relevant output shares to its to a batch's aggregate, but the other aggregator does not consider that aggregation job to be complete and therefore has not committed that data, the entire batch will become uncollectible, which may constitute tens of thousands of reports or more. Yes.
So I want to suggest that. So I think. I mean, based on what we know now, I think we just have to close this issue. I don't think. First of all, it only matters for multi-round VDAFs. So this is not like a pressing problem, and I think like implementation experience might tell us like how pressing this actually is. So I think like if we think leaders are okay with the current set of requirements, I think we can, close this and move on. I guess yeah, go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with Chris, especially since if I understand the description of the problem right, and it's very likely I don't, this depends on like a formulation of a VDAF that doesn't exist, not just one that's multi-round, but one where the leader has some measure of like freedom of choice of how to construct things like preparation messages. My expectation broadly would be that if the malicious leader does tamper with the prep message in some way, but that should cause like the proof well, sorry, I should be speaking in more generic VDAF terms. It should cause VDAF preparation to fail. So I just feel like this attack being a concern requires on like so many what ifs. We need a multi-step VDAF, and that admits this kind of like malleability or forgeability of prepare messages, and these other things, such that it's a little hard without a more substantial attack like in hand now to argue for making protocol changes, especially given that we would really like to be getting these documents to completion in the near future.
So I think the way to the intuition that I have, and I think is right, is when the client sends a report, it's generating some randomness, like shares of randomness that the aggregators are going to use for input validation. It's not safe to use this more than once. So like once you consume an FLP, you should never query that FLP again. That's the general principle. Yeah, that's all.
For what it's worth, I would also support simply closing this issue and sticking with the status quo for SKU recovery. Simply out of paranoia.
I think that's the decision unless anyone wants to jump in the queue and object, I think.
I kind of want to throw Martin under the queue here because I think he's got a good idea in the chat. Martin, I can relay your thought if you'd rather not.
That's fine. Go on video and everything. So, oh damn, that's slow. So the suggestion there is to avoid this problem at the VDAF layer and say that if you're constructing a VDAF, then the VDAF needs to have a deterministic function for determining the messages that it sends during preparation. However,
so it absolutely does. An honest aggregator always its computations are completely deterministic. A malicious aggregator gets to flip coins, and there's no way of really controlling its behavior there.
I was going to say the other thing that occurs to me is that the leader potentially gets to choose what reports are in the batch, and so you can just ask with a different set of reports potentially if it has to rewind all the way back to the start again, and that creates a different problem. So I guess we just put two nails in that particular idea. So great.
Anyone else got anything else? This was the big one. So, well, it might. Well, no, actually, I think extensibility is going to be the big one. All right, we'll move on. We'll probably, we'll wait until next week to close the issue in case anyone has any other thoughts. But it sounds like people are okay with doing nothing here. All right, I will take over, Bran. Thank you. Okay. Extensibility. So DAP has a few ways. There's a few ways. There's a few things one might want to extend in the DAP ecosystem. The obvious one is VDAFs. You might want to support different VDAFs. A less obvious one is specific to DAP with this thing we call batch modes. As a reminder, basically, the collector gets to decide how to partition reports into batches. Actually, the protocol participants decide how to partition reports into batches, but there's multiple ways you might do that, and we need to agree on what to do in the protocol. So the batch mode tells us, like, what is the semantics, what are the restrictions for partitioning reports into batches. Okay. And then the other one is report extension. So report extension is I send, there's right now, so like basically I include an extension with my report, and when an aggregator encounters that extension, if it recognizes it, it uses that to decide how to process the report. If it doesn't recognize it, it has to just reject the report. That is, extensions are mandatory to implement in DAP. Okay. So the question, so currently the extensions, they're essentially private extensions for each aggregator. So when I encrypt my input share and I send it to one of the aggregators, in that plain text, there is an extension field. So the idea is that I can send extensions that I intend for one of the aggregators, but not both. That is so that, like, if there's an extension, say that the leader recognizes but the helper doesn't, then we're good to go. Martin asked if we could add public extensions. That is, this would be like an extension point in the metadata. So there's two things that we can do here. The minimal change is we just add this field, and then we include, extend the processing rule so that it applies to both. So when I'm processing extensions, I look at both the public extensions and my private extensions. My as I'm the helper, or I'm the leader. The other thing we can do is we can remove the private extensions altogether. So this would actually, so people remind, in the olden days of draft 2, we actually had only public extensions. We moved them to private extensions for a few reasons. The main one being is we wanted them to be mandatory to implement, and if an aggregator encountered an extension it didn't recognize, there needed to be this possibility of different sets of extensions for each server. So there's at least one use case for this that exists. But we might decide here that we don't really care about this use case. So I just wanted to open this for discussion. So question 1, do we add public extensions? Question 2, if we add public extensions, do we remove the private extensions? Go ahead, Tim.
Thank you. Okay, so off the bat, I think we cannot remove private extensions because I think they're going to be necessary for modes of authentication that we want to support. So imagine something where a client authenticates to either aggregator using like an OAuth2 token, where the token itself is sensitive. You don't want to expose that to both aggregators because then, one of the aggregators is the actual validator of the token in question. You don't want the other aggregator to be able to see that token because then it would be able to impersonate the client in question. So I think we need private extensions. We should not get rid of them. So as for public extensions, I guess I'm not opposed to them because I suspect it'd be quite easy to add them. But I wonder if essentially the sort of trick that TaskProv already uses suffices. If I remember right, and the way TaskProv works is that what's in the extension is just like a bit indicating that there is a TaskProv message in an HTTP header. And then probably also like a digest of the header value is mixed into the AAD for the encrypted portion of the message, right? So my point is, as far as public extensions go, would it suffice to put whatever the actual content is in an HTTP header, and then use a private extension to indicate the presence of that thing and bind it to the AAD? But so maybe it's simpler to just define public extensions.
So let me start off with you're misremembering how TaskProv works. So all the extension does is say if the extension is present, then what the leader does is it checks, what the aggregators do is they make sure that the task ID matches the serialization of the task config. It doesn't say where that comes from. That's like an optional feature in the spec that not everyone is necessarily going to implement. We could totally dump extensions in HTTP headers if we wanted to. I don't know if that would be my first design choice, but that's definitely a valid design.
Now that I think of it, I think it actually wouldn't work because the problem is, if we imagine some public extension that is per report, then at some point you need to transmit those extensions to the helper. And when that happens, many reports get bundled up into a single HTTP message for an aggregation job. So I think you would need some per report or per report share extension point, right? Which I think would take us back toward a public extension point that is in the upload message. Okay, sorry, I've been talking a lot. So concisely, I think I support public extensions defined in the DAP message, and I strongly feel we should keep private extensions. Martin, go ahead.
Thanks.
Yeah, so the taskprov thing, I think, is a bit unfortunate in the way that it's structured, because it uses an existing field to bind to the reports. It uses the task ID. It might actually be better to solve that with a public extension, saying that I've got a task provisioned, and this is the task, to detach the two of them. But I understand how taskprov ends up where it is, and maybe that's special enough to not need this sort of thing. To Tim's point about private tokens, I don't think that bearer tokens are things we should be encouraging people to use. And if that is absolutely essential, then it turns out you can encrypt the things that are in the extensions, just like we did with ECH. That would be possible, if not the ideal thing to do. It would probably cost a little more in terms of the number of bytes, because you probably want to put an auth tag in there. Maybe you could get away without one. So I was looking at the Apple's draft of the report authentication, which uses, I believe it's one of the anonymous tokens, the privacy pass tokens, in order to do that. That to me seems like something that you could have in public, because they're just signatures. And so I don't see that one as being particularly problematic in terms of making that public from the outset as well. I'm a little concerned about the amount of complexity that is involved in the protocol generally, and having 2 extension points is probably fine. I could live with it, but I don't think that we need both. So, okay.
So just quickly on your point about taskprov. So like specifically what we can do is to avoid overloading the task ID is we could stick the hash of the task config in the extension payload. And that would be sufficient.
It would be sufficient to bind it. It would not allow you to create a task as a result, because then no one would know what the task ID is.
That is yes, that's yeah, basically what I was getting at.
Yeah.
It's also a nice way of expressing that the collector is in the loop as well. So the collector, I mean, we could spell this probably isomorphically, but right now the collector has to know the task ID in order to collect results. That is, it has to agree with the aggregators on what the thing is, what the task
exactly.
config. Yeah,
and that sort of agreement, but the current structure of taskprov sort of ensures that agreement is invariant. So I don't mind the current structure of taskprov. I'm not looking to solve that particular problem, such as it is. In fact, that would make the use of taskprov less reasonable, because you, if you had a task ID and a separate taskprov extension, you've just made the whole thing bigger by that much.
Yeah,
so,
that's true.
Yeah.
Amir asks, Martin, you might want to respond to this actually. Amir asks in chat, can anyone elaborate on the communication costs? It's just that it's more bytes to encrypt? Question.
Yeah, so it is more bytes to encrypt. One of the things that we've been looking at with the use of DAP for some of these advertising use cases is that the amount of data that's involved is hugely significant. We're talking billions of items ultimately, and so okay, so another 5 bytes per thing, that's gigabytes, and that's real money at that point. And we're not talking about 5 for a lot of these extensions. It's going to be a bit more than that. So we're looking to shave down as much as we can. And in the case of bulk submissions, which is one of the drafts that I put up last week, the bulk submission would have extensions in every single one of those reports. And with the right compression, if it were public, you could compress them effectively. And so you pay that cost only once. But with private extensions, you have to just encrypt every single one of them. And so you're amplifying that cost by a billion in that case.
Yeah, I do actually really like the what that extension, what that draft does, and I think it's something we should work on. Yeah, just Martin, on that note, some of our tag length or our length tags are 4 bytes, which is way bigger than we like actually need in some cases. As you're looking at things, if there's things like that you want to shave off, definitely let us know.
Yeah, my experience with things like extension to code points in TLS is that there's a relatively small set of them, and 4 bytes is like more than you'll ever need. But so is also 2, and it may be the case that some of these could be 2 quite reasonably, or we could do the quick thing and go with variable length.
Yeah. Chris
or as
once
Tim points
proposed
out,
that, but we just haven't had time to. It's a pretty big change to the document, and no one's taken the time basically. So
you also end up with these non-determinism things because there's multiple ways to encode the same value in quick, which is fine for quick, but not necessarily fine for a protocol like this. So that's a problem. And Tim points out that if you start small, you can also say there's an extension that extends the space in various ways.
Yeah,
there are ways around it. Yeah.
Cool. I'm gonna say the consensus here. So I agree with Tim. I'm wary about. I think that we've sort of ossified the private extensions feature. I think we should definitely add public extensions. So unless anybody objects, I think that's what the PR is going to do to close this issue. And like
I'm happy with that. I just don't know what the private extensions are after this discussion.
So the one sort of hypothetical one I have in my mind is imagine one of the aggregators is like using the report auth extension that you were looking at, but not the other. So I'm gonna redeem a token for every report that I consume. But I don't necessarily want to. It might not be operationally feasible to loop in the other aggregator into that process.
Yeah. So if that were the leader, which I think it would be the more logical one in that case, then I don't know why you wouldn't just do that as part of the submission process. So here's my report. Here's my report. And by the way, here's a what's the authorization header field in HTTP? You just dump your bearer token in that.
Right.
And then the leader is happy that everything's happened. I don't see a case where only the helper is validating tokens. That doesn't make any sense to me because it doesn't save you any work. But if you were able to, if you did need to do that, it's possible to use a public extension to get that information to a helper. It's just a little more tricky, that's all. As I said, I'm not committed to this. I just, in the absence of a single use case that I can't answer with private extensions, I would do that. I would just not include them, but that's just me.
Okay. Yeah, I guess Brian and Tim and I can get together and put our heads together and make a call here if folks are comfortable with that.
Hey, Ben Schwartz. Could a collection of private extensions be defined in the future as a public extension?
Can you explain a little bit more?
That's what I think Tim is talking about. Yeah.
Okay.
And so the idea would be that you create a public extension that is then individually encrypted toward each of the aggregators, and it becomes a private extension at that point.
Right, but it avoids separately privately encrypting each private extension.
Yes. It's a little annoying to use that sort of thing for various reasons because of the way that you have to structure the encryption and that sort of thing, but I think it is feasible. It's possible.
It also incurs the risk that Like we'd be leaving it up to this to these public extensions that are encrypting their contents to devise the encryption scheme. So at least like I think DApp would. I think we've already agreed that public extensions, however they are, have to be incorporated in the AAD on uploads. So the integrity is okay. Sorry, the authenticity is okay. But if we leave it up to individual public extensions that want to encrypt their contents to figure out how to encrypt themselves, they might get it wrong, right? So that's maybe the merit of having private extensions. But I would kind of lean towards saying like that we gain more simplicity by removing private extensions than we sort of gain safety from by specifying how to do the encryption.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can, there's an obvious way to do this correctly, I think. It's more, I think any solution is more complicated than what we have today. And I think if we can bear the cost in specification complexity, which I don't think is too bad. Again, like we can kind of like wait until we have a PR and then continue this discussion. That might be the way to handle this. My expectation is that this isn't too bad, but we haven't tried to spell it. So there is also DApp version 2. Everyone's really excited about version 2. Okay, I'm gonna say that's where we're going next. We're gonna have a PR. We'll look at the protocol complexity and decide if we're okay with it. Hopefully next week or as early as tomorrow. Sound good to everybody? No one's jumping into the queue, so I'm gonna move on. Thanks, Amir. Okay, this one is this one's a little hairier. So this was another feature that Martin requested in an issue. So Brandon and David and I and others discussed this yesterday, and we're kind of like not super comfortable with what it entails. So let me kind of describe what Martin wants, and let's see if we can put our heads together and figure this out. So basically, I have a random leader and I have a random helper on the internet. What set of report extensions do they support? There's no mechanism for advertising this. It's not like part of the task config. The task config is not like have a required format or anything like that. So there's like no .well known for DApp right now. There is like partially. So what if another thing we can think about doing is probing for extensions. So if like if the aggregators can't process my report, I figure out what extensions I need to remove in order to get my report processed. So that's the idea of probing. So now we can kind of partially support this. The leader has an opportunity during the upload phase to, look at the public extensions, decrypt its private extensions, and make sure that none of the extensions there are going to be a blocker, and then continue. But it doesn't provide much feedback. Like there's just like a simple kind of abort unrecognized message or something like that, very generic. The other problem is there's no opportunity for to probe the helper at all. The helper just rejects during aggregation. The client never actually interacts with the helper during that phase. So the question here is, do we want to have a mechanism for advertising the supported extensions? Do we want to figure out how to have the client probe for reported extensions? So that's kind of the two questions to play around with. Some considerations we thought of yesterday. There may be like reasons I might not want to advertise the set of extensions I support. Maybe I have something non-standard and I don't want to tell you what that code point is because I don't want you to ossify on that code point. And then sort of just implicit in the design of DApp today is this idea that the client already knows who the aggregators are. So part of the task config is these URLs that identify each of the parties, and some out of bound mechanism is supposed to tell me like who these are. So perhaps this is not a question we should deal with in the DApp draft. Let's do it. Go ahead, Tim.
Okay, so first off, I'm wary of any flow where a client would say, "Hey, leader, what do you support?" and then decide what to do what to do accordingly, because I worry that this opens us to time of check to time of use problems. But what I'm wondering is, following from some stuff Martin was saying in the chat, sort of clarifying his question, would it work if in the error returned, say by the leader when it gets an upload from the client? Excuse me. The scenario of interest, right, is the client constructs a message that contains extensions that the leader doesn't understand. So right now the leader just says no. If instead it returned, if it said no due to unsupported extension, and if that error message contained a list of the code points of the rejected extensions, then the client will be able to decide whether or not it wants to try again without those extensions, or if it wants to give up. However, that doesn't help for the case where the helper supports fewer extensions than the leader, because the helper never gets an opportunity to tell the client, here's the extensions that you included that were rejected. However, I don't know, the case where the leader and helper have just don't have the same set, or at least some shared subset of extensions supported, seems a little unlikely to me, because even in the case of something like TaskProv, which is sort of the on-demand dynamic task generation thing, there's still the notion of this task author in that system that presumably have the opportunity to go to set up the deployments such that the leader and helper are chosen to have the necessary overlapping capabilities. So I think I lean towards extending the error message in this situation. Sorry, let me be more clear. What I think we should do is extend the error message provided by the leader in this situation so that it indicates explicitly to the client which extensions were rejected. So that should, neither admit TOC, TOU problems, nor leak to the client support for extensions that the client doesn't need to know about.
Cool. Thanks, Watson.
So I sort of understand this to be something that why can't task provisioning handle this? You say to the client, here's the extensions you need to support to do this, and maybe the question is, okay, how do we know what clients out there are looking at this task and able to support? I don't think you need when it comes time to actually submit, know that the task you've been given still requires the extension that you were told at the outset it had to have. Maybe I'm missing something, but that's my impression.
Just to kind of separate a couple things. So TaskProv is itself a report extension, and it doesn't specify anything that's required for the core DApp protocol. So task provisioning is out of band. That's how we have to think about it. I guess you would imagine you could have a task provisioning mechanism that said, hey, here are the extensions I want you to support if you don't upload a report.
Conceptually, I guess I'm not sure where the clients, you have a population, some of whom can make use of an extension, some of whom can't, and you want to mix those reports together in the same job.
I see what you're saying.
And I'm not talking about task provisioning the proposal. I'm talking about task provisioning in general. That should be where we set up all the parameters everybody needs to make sure it all works conceptually. And here we're just looking at seeing that you've made a mistake and giving good feedback on it. That's just how I'm approaching this.
Right. I definitely want to hear from Martin on that, because he seems to have right now the most advanced use cases for task extensions. So the question, just to reiterate, is shouldn't you require that all clients for a task like support the same set of report extensions? I think that's a really interesting question. Brandon, why don't you jump in here?
Yeah, first, I definitely support extending the existing error messages that we generate to include specificity on which extension caused the upload to be rejected. I do think that if we go this way, we should specify it in a programmatic manner. Like, don't just stick it into a details error string. Include some field that includes some numeric values. But further than that, I think if we want to do something more than that, like actually have probing for extension support, I think this is a concern that would fit much better in a task provisioning scheme. DAP already assumes that there's a lot of out-of-band configuration where sort of the clients and the aggregators just know what their peers can support or how they're configured. And a lot of that is addressed by task provisioning. I don't necessarily know that this sort of probing would fit well with, say, task prof specifically, but I think that that's where we should look if we want to include better support for probing for supported extensions.
Okay. Thanks. Martin, sorry, I was going to ask you before you bring up your thing if you could respond to Bran, but I forgot what the question I was going to ask, so just go ahead.
Yeah, I think Brandon essentially hit the nail on the head with what I was originally thinking here, which was having a separate error code for this would be consistent with that of the thing that we do in TLS, which is the unsupported extension error code, which would allow the client to be able to say, that worked because one of my extensions didn't work, and of course, to the suggestion from Tim or David or someone in the chat, let's just give the leader the possibility of encoding some information about that in the payload of that request and that error message, and not really be very specific about that sort of thing.
So let me just try to clarify. So what we want is a new error type that for the leader to send to the client saying, hey, I don't recognize the extensions, and then in the problem details document we get to enumerate the code points. If
you like.
Okay.
I wouldn't necessarily make that a mandatory thing to do, but to Tim's point, yes, you could do that. You could codify that if you wanted to. The other thing I would observe there is that if you didn't want to enumerate the things that were there, that should be an option as well. Most of the protocols that we have defined have a sort of generic error code that you could use. If you felt like there was some sort of security issue with revealing the more specific one. I know that some TLS implementations do that for some of the error codes that are in TLS.
Brandon, I think I'm hearing that I think everyone's in agreement here. The enumerating the unrecognized extension is optional. You're the one who wants it programmatic. Can I ask you to write the PR so we make sure we get it right?
Yeah, makes sense.
All right, thank you. Sam?
Martin, earlier in the chat, you were saying that your request was getting misinterpreted. Is what's going on here beyond what you're asking for?
Only slightly, but I think it might be in a constructive way. So what folks are doing here is turning that into something much more useful. I was just looking to make sure that we didn't end up in a situation where we have potentially newer clients that are being driven by random websites, and those random websites are using DAP indirectly through report submissions from browsers, for instance. And the browser has been updated to support new extensions and would generate those new extensions by default. And we have to work out how the submission process goes for all of that. In that case, I would probably not, in our particular use case, I would probably not have the newer, I would probably land the responsibility for dealing with this problem on the websites that are driving the browsers, but there are other scenarios that we have for particularly our telemetry submission that we potentially have an old aggregator that is getting new extensions, and we have to make sure that we don't submit them in those cases, have to try again, for instance.
Okay. Taking my chair hat off, I want to go back to something that I heard Chris say about why can't we require all the clients to have the same set of extensions? And I may have misunderstood what you were saying or the setup here, but I do want to make sure that we are allowing for deployment of new extensions, because you cannot cause, if you require that everyone have a homogeneous set, you're never going to be able to incrementally deploy. All right.
I think that's right.
Great. I'm just not thinking through it right, but I hope you have.
No, that hadn't occurred to me before. Watson, does that make sense to you? The need for, so we can't necessarily guarantee that all reports have the same set of extensions because of incremental deployment. There might be a time where there's a new extension that's added or a new extension that's an old extension that's removed by the same set of clients.
A little. I think it really depends on what extensions are doing.
That's true.
To for this to work. But I think even then, it's, you can give the reason most of the time the client is going to have put the right extensions in the report, that in the task provisioning, what that universe of supportable extensions on the thing receiving it is.
Right.
And you just might be missing some from older clients.
I think what we're talking about is a problem as old as IETF.
Oh yeah.
Like,
absolutely.
It's not something that we're, I think where we are is like, we can't constrain it. This is like the set of extensions that you support at any given time is a security consideration for your deployment, but I don't think we could say anything sweeping in the DAP draft about it.
Just contemplate, if someone agrees to this, would it break things?
Right.
Okay.
I'm trying to be conscious of time. I have one more question here, and then quickly go through the rest of the things. Sam, when do you want to cut me off?
I don't.
Okay. Martin, how much time do you need?
Take the time you need.
Okay.
That stuff's more important than mine.
All right. Thanks. Okay, my last question here, Martin, is what about the fact that the client can't probe the helper? So you might still end up in a situation where the helper doesn't recognize something and then it has to reject.
Yeah, and in those scenarios, I don't think it's as much of a problem. It's a very small coordination problem. You've got a leader and the helpers that the leader is dealing with, usually just one. And in that case, I think it's perfectly reasonable for the leader to understand, at least on a per task basis, what extensions have been enabled.
Sounds good. We'll just maybe make a note of it in the text somewhere.
Yeah, I think that's probably worth saying, that there's an expectation that the leader knows what extensions it can use, and that includes its own capabilities and those of the helpers that it's dealing with.
Sounds good. Moving right along. What was the next slide? I forget. Aha. Yeah, this is one I definitely, especially folks who have been around IETF for a long time. I don't know if we're spelling this right. So Martin raised an issue against the task prov draft. That's the essence of which is, how do I extend this? Like, how do I add? So as a reminder, task prov specifies an encoding for like a VDAF config or a DP config. So this is actually the draft will create a registry for DP mechanisms, and this is because at the time we were writing the draft, this didn't exist anywhere else in DAP, and we just added the code point because we knew we were going to need it. So that's why that's there. So the question Martin asks is, how do I add new things? And this kind of, there's a few variants of this problem. There is different DAP batch modes, there's new VDAS, and there's new DP mechanisms. So I want to describe my vision so far for how we handle this problem, and I want you guys to poke holes at it and figure out what's wrong. Just looking ahead real quick, there is a related issue for DAP draft itself, but I want to focus right now just on DP mechanisms. The general idea is that the extension points in this draft are designed to allow for parsing unrecognized variants. So we have something like this DP config has a length prefix in front of it in the task config structure, and the first byte after the length prefix is the variant, and then the rest of it is like the data that's specific to that variant, and you need to know what the variant in order to parse. So that's the idea. That's how extension points work. So you can still parse the task config even if you don't recognize a variant. That's the goal. Now, a new document that defines, say, a new DP config would modify this structure. And here's the way we spell it right now. So we have a section in the taskprov draft that says extending this document. The behavior of task bind, that's the name, that's what we call the extension of the draft. I suppose we could change this if we wanted. Anyway, the behavior of this extension, this report extension, may be extended by future documents that define, one of the following things. Such documents should include a section titled task bind considerations or taskprov considerations that specifies an encoding of any configuration parameters that are needed for the thing that you're specifying. And I don't really quite know how to spell this, but that's the idea. Questions, comments? Martin, I'm having a hard time following the chat. Why don't you just hop on?
Yeah, I'm just gonna say it. So the first hole is that your DP mechanism thing depends on you being able to understand the mechanism so that you can ignore the right number of bytes. Now, if your requirement is that the DP mechanism is understood, then you never have a problem because you try to configure the thing, you say DP mechanism foo, and then foo is not understood, then you just can't parse the thing. So I don't think that's a major problem.
Well, let me I want to quickly dispense with that. So the way this is spelled in the draft, imagine before this struct thing, there is a uint16 length field that tells you the length of that thing. Okay,
so you just missed that on the slides? Or am I?
I missed it on the slides.
Okay, no big deal. You're just defining a standard sort of extensibility mechanism at that point, and we're all good. That's easy. The more serious problem that I have is that the types of extensions that I'm considering, and there's a bunch of them in the draft, are not DP mechanism related. So they're necessary for differential privacy, but they're not fundamentally a differential privacy thing. So the specific one is that we're looking to bind each one of the reports to the identity of the website that asks for it. And the website that asks for it also needs to be bound to the task so that the task doesn't aggregate up reports from different websites, which would violate the differential privacy guarantees that we're looking for. And so that's something else. It's not a DP mechanism, it's not a VDAF, and it's not a batch mode.
And the identity of the website, it would be like right now, your only option is to put it in like a report extension.
So it would be in the report extensions, but it would also need to be part of the task configuration because the task would reject things that don't have matching site identities.
So your question is really about extending the task config struct itself.
That's where I'm at.
All right.
Which is why I ended up with
we don't have a solution
as a separate thing. Yeah.
Tim's got a bright idea. He's about to solve it.
Well, yeah, I mean, what Martin is describing now, it sounds like you need an ability to arbitrarily extend task config structures. But this is already what we've done for extensions on DAP reports, right? I mean, why can't we just have an extension point where you can stick an arbitrary opaque blob in there? Because taskprov never needs to parse that particular blob, right? It'll be whatever other sort of I guess, extension onto DAP. So from TaskProf's point of view, it just needs to sort of take this opaque blob and hand it on to something else. So wouldn't something like a registry of code points and then opaque blob do it?
Well, we don't need a registry, but you're basically, we need an extension point. Literally just a list of extensions in the task config. We do need a registry. We do need a registry.
Yes, you need a registry for the code points in that blob. It's a standard TLS extension mechanism that you've used in the reports. Would work perfectly well here.
Okay. Okay. Let me look at the. I don't know if my co-editor Shan is here. I don't see him. Thank you for clarifying that. I don't see why we couldn't add that. I'll put up a PR and I'll get some feedback. And but yeah, I don't see why we couldn't do this.
For what it's worth, I think the existing extension points are probably 100% essential. Like different VDAFs, yes. Different DP mechanisms, probably yes. The only question I would then have is, once you have a generic extension capability, how much does that alleviate your concerns about, for instance, the differential privacy aspect? Could the differential privacy portion be done by a differential privacy document that defines an actual mechanism as opposed to just the word none?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the vision there is that you have different variants that it's been a while since, so folks might remember probably a couple of years ago by now, there was this DP draft that was intended to kind of imbue this extension point with some semantics, and it would be something like, I don't think I know enough about differential privacy to say anything elegant there, but so Martin, let me ask you, do you want to keep, we're going to keep VDAF config extension point, we're going to keep the batch mode extension point, we're going to keep the DP mechanism extension point, we're going to add just a generic list of extensions to the task config, and that should do it.
Yeah, that's what I would say. And then I think the DP mechanism could potentially use that rather than try to solve that problem in this draft, because what you have right now is an empty extension bucket, and it's got DP on it, and that's all it says.
I see what you're saying. Yeah,
something that's a bit more concrete, which says, here's my DP mechanism as an extension, and then another extension potentially that contains some parameters for that DP mechanism, or whatever goes with that one.
Cool.
I think the version of DP that David implemented for libprio, which is the 2 independent Laplacian noise things, would have an epsilon parameter, and I think that would be sufficient for that one. And we could define that, in fact. I think that's actually a pretty reasonable thing to define from the outset.
Yeah. Cool. That one I'm less certain about, given where implementations are today. We might just want to keep that. It might be movable, but let me get some feedback on that and get back to you. But there will be at least a PR for adding an list of extensions to the task config. And if we decide, in the future we're just going to kill the DP mechanism, move it elsewhere, then we'll just have, we can do that in the future too. Okay. Cool. This is a different topic than I was planning on discussing here, but we have a similar question here. I think we're not going to do anything about this right now. But just to say that we probably do have to do something here now that I think about it. We have batch modes, there are a couple structures like messages that are extended by batch modes theoretically, that future batch modes. So there's in the aggregation job and in the collection job, there's this field that depends on the batch mode. So let's see here. What do I want to say about this? What we need to add, like following the principle that everything that you should be able to decode unrecognized variants, we should add a length prefix to these, which is a wire breaking change. So let me just ask, does anybody object to a wire breaking change in draft 13 to aggregation and collection, just to make sure that we can always decode?
I'm struggling here. Is there ever any situation where you receive one of these things with a batch mode that you don't understand, and you expect to be able to do anything other than return an error?
Good question. So the batch mode is determined by the task config. By now, you have agreed on the task config. So at this point in the code, it actually is not an issue that manifests.
Right.
It's about,
so if you're going to make a breaking change,
of separating decoding, like message decoding, from protocol logic. So
right. I really don't care then. Great.
Cool.
Carry on.
All right, I'm gonna add it just to make myself feel better, unless no one objects, unless anybody objects. Okay. All right, miscellaneous. Here we go. Let's make these quick. Okay, so this is just informing folks. Thanks, Ben, for pointing out this issue with the spec and kind of forcing us to solve it. In VDAF, in the latest VDAF draft, we've changed the aggregation API to be streaming. Basically, you initialize aggregation with an empty aggregate share, and then you can update that aggregate share as you go. And this there's this notion of like bucket that we have to introduce. This is related to this is something that Simon asked about like 2 years ago or something like that. That was not explicitly in the draft, but it's a feature of existing implementations. You end up spreading your aggregate share against different units of storage, and then you end up merging them just before collection. So we basically just like made this explicit in the API. This is not a breaking change. This is just massaging the spec so that we actually do aggregation during an aggregation job. So that's what. Does anybody have any questions on this, Ben? If you wanted to share any thoughts, I saw you read the PR.
Nope. Thanks for cleaning that up.
You're welcome. Thanks for pointing it out. Okay, task start time. This, I think, is people largely like this. So we have an expiration date for tasks. We don't have a start time for tasks. Elsewhere in protocol engineering, if we say something expires, we also say when it starts to exist. So this is like what we do in like X509 certificates and stuff like that. It seems like a good idea to have here. Basically, the idea is you're allowed to reject reports that whose timestamps are before the start time for the task. So this lets you basically like you get to configure tasks that are not used until the future. But if a client like starts uploading too early, you just reject it. Does anybody have any objection to this feature? So we're changing the task config serialization, task config serialization to add this parameter, and we're imbuing this parameter with semantics in the DAP draft. Related question is about may versus must. So the current language. Go ahead, Tim.
So I have one idea that I don't know, but I really like, but I'll say it anyway. Okay, sorry. Elsewhere in the draft, I think elsewhere in DAP, and I believe this is where we define like the span of time or the interval covered by a given batch. What we do rather than start and end is we do start and then like a length of time. And the reason we did this is because it makes it impossible to encode an invalid interval where the end is before the start. So we might want to do that here for consistency, although that being said, maybe it's more natural to have explicit start and end dates, but I kind of like making it impossible to construct invalid time windows.
I like that idea. That's a little bit more. That's a little bit bigger of a change, but I have no objection. Does anybody have anybody object to that change? Junior, do you have any thoughts here? This is related to your PR.
Wait, can you repeat the question? Sorry, like what Tim was saying.
Okay, so right now you have a start time. So it sounds like there's consensus to make this change. So the idea of the current PR is you have a start time and an end time. These are both timestamps. Tim's idea is to say you have a start time and then you have a task duration. So the end time is the start time plus that duration, and that's how you get that other timestamp. The advantage of this is that you can't encode invalid time ranges. So imagine your start time and end time, like your duration is negative, so your end time is before your start time. So we want to be able to avoid encoding that invalid interval. So it's a change to the encoding, but otherwise does not mess with the semantics of the system. So, Junior, you don't object? All right, we will make that change. Thanks for the suggestion, Tim. That's a good idea. So for those following along at home, we have a big pile of breaking changes before from draft 12 to draft 13 so far. Not that big of a pile, but we have some breaking changes. Okay, I think this is the last slide. So this is, I think, should be, well, okay, this is slightly controversial now that we might change this. So assuming that we keep the DP mechanisms in that code point in the task prop draft, we would like to change the encoding of the mechanism variant from 1 byte to 4 bytes. That way we can have more than 255, 256, whatever variants. Anybody object to that? Hearing no objection.
You have
I
Watson and Tim and Q.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Watson.
I support this. I mean, it's not just about the number. It's about being able to do things like have experimental ranges and such. Life's just easier with more bits.
Got it. Thanks.
Can you remind me, Chris, which message DP mechanism appears in?
It's in task config in task prov.
Okay, so I guess the concern here is what Martin was touching on earlier about we do want to shave bytes off of messages, so making length bytes smaller where we can is an interesting idea. And like I think Amir just said in the chat, will we ever really have 4 billion different DP mechanisms?
We won't. That it's consistent with VDAF. So for VDAF, we do have 4 bytes. We felt 2 bytes was not enough because 65,000 sounds like a lot of different VDAFs, but when you consider that we have a different code point for each PRIO variant, where a variant is given by like a different arithmetic circuit, it sort of makes sense to be a little bit more conservative. So it's just for consistency with the VDAF draft. I'm fine with 2 bytes. But to your concern, the task config is not sent by every client. It's sent once per aggregation job in the case, and when you actually use the task prov config mechanism. So this is not a blow up for each report. This is just like a one-time thing.
So I must be missing something. I thought the client had to indicate to the leader what the task config is at least once.
Oh, yes. You're right.
So this could be making like actually the most frequent message in the protocol bigger by a couple of bytes. Anyway,
This would be, yeah.
To get back around to like a concrete actionable thing, I would lean toward a 2-byte identifier here.
Okay. Junior, that's your PR. Do you object to changing it to 2 bytes? Okay, cool. That is it for DAP issues. Thank you all for your patience. That was super productive.
And thanks for leading it, Chris and Brandon. So I think we are done with this part of the agenda. Anything else on DAP? Martin?
I was just getting ready for the next part, assuming that is me. Fair enough. I'll do that then.
You are the next part.
I am the next part. So in the discussions on advertising use cases, we have concluded that histogram aggregation is the right thing to do and the thing that we want to be able to do. And that looks, in the very simplest case, like the histogram in the VDAF document. However, for flexibility reasons, we have 2 problems that we're looking to solve with that. The first one is that it is desirable to have a 0 histogram being submitted, and this comes down to the differential privacy design that we have, whereby we don't want to reveal to anyone, helpers and leaders included, that the measurement contains no information. The suggestion that was made was that you can say that when someone's submitting nothing, they submit a histogram with a value of 1 in the 0 bucket, but that turns out to change your sensitivity analysis in a kind of negative way. So you end up having to add more noise if you're doing differential privacy on the outputs. So we decided that that was probably not ideal. The other thing is that for these advertising use cases, the folks there would like to be able to say something other than a 1 in 1 bucket. They want to be able to say that the total value is variable, so that you can, for instance, say that someone converted and they bought the expensive thing, so I'm going to put a 10 in the bucket, and maybe they bought the non-expensive thing, so we're going to put a 3 in one of those buckets. And maybe even going further, just being able to say, I've got a value of 10 and I'd like to split it 5 in this bucket, 5 in that bucket, or 7 and 3, or what have you. So all of those things sort of lead to an L1 bound, which is the sum of the buckets in the histogram add up to a certain amount. And it turns out there's nothing in the VDAF draft that does that. So I wrote something up and David fixed it for me so that we can submit a histogram that contains an L1 bound norm, and that's it. That's the entire draft. It's very short. So I'll take questions and feedback. I guess one of the main questions that I would have is whether or not folks think folks are comfortable here with me taking it to this group as opposed to the CFRG. I'm kind of firmly of the opinion that we should have taken VDAF to a working group anyway. It's mostly engineering, but happy to hear from others.
I think it's absolutely something we could work on here. Really, the goal with the vision that we've had for Prio is you have this you have flexibility to kind of specify different bounds on valid measurements, and there's a standard way to kind of express that bound. And it's really not a question for cryptographers. It's a question of like just designing a circuit. There is a little bit of math, but it's something I think we can handle. So I think it's absolutely in scope for us, and it doesn't really require changing the charter or anything like that. Unlike, we could argue about like if we're designing brand new VDAFs that have different design principles, we could discuss, doing that in a different venue. But in this case, I just don't think we need to.
Tim?
So first, should anybody do this work at all? Yes, clearly this work is useful in and of itself because it does something that Martin would like to ship. 2, it's sort of meta useful in that it helps us prove that we have the right sort of affordances in documents like VDAF that allow you're writing documents that depend on it, which is also good. Then the question of where to do it, we should do it here in PPM. We have all the right people here, and that, from consultation in the past with CFRG chairs, the direction that I got was that we should be doing this stuff in PPM.
Wow, that sounds pretty straightforward to me. I wasn't even going to ask for adoption, but maybe this is a good time to have that discussion. I know we have an open issue, which is trying to get an implementation together, and we're on the hook for that. But that's probably the biggest open question on this one. All right, I'll turn that over to the chairs. That's all I had for this one. I'll poke you if you don't start an adoption call or start a discussion on that at some point, and we'll see.
Okay. We could certainly run a poll if there's a poll that you would like to run. I see that there are 16 people in the room. If anybody would like to run a poll, let me know. For example, we could run a poll of how many people have reviewed this new draft, but it might be a little early for that. All right. Well, if anybody wants to thinks we ought to run that poll right now, let me know. Otherwise, I'll give people a few days to go read it and think about it, and we'll come back to that question. Tim?
I think we could go ahead and do a poll that is essentially an adoption call here. However, in my opinion, my experience, we would need to confirm that adoption call with the posting to the PPM list regardless.
That's right.
Which I imagine would get exactly the same people who would respond to the poll here in this interim to reply by email. But yeah, I would support going ahead and doing a poll right now.
All right, Sam, do you have a thought on that?
No, with 16 people in the room, I'd rather hear if we have anyone who has a reason to not adopt it here, and then take it to the list.
All right. Okay. Well, so if this would be a great time to raise any concerns about adopting this draft in PPM, so people have some time to think about it. This is not an adoption call yet.
All right. I don't see any hands.
Okay. I believe we've come to the end of our agenda. So last call for any comments, and then we'll close the meeting.
Thanks for joining us. My apologies again. My sincere apologies to Martin for not coordinating agenda with you.
No problem. That's perfectly fine. I can wing it. I would have liked to have been able to put some slides together so that I can show people pictures of what I mean, but I think most people understand what it was.
Yeah. I look forward to seeing some of you in Dublin, even though we're not formally meeting there.
Bye, everybody. Thanks.